This week we're going to be creating a series of image renders. So we're not working with any animation tools or keyframing this week. We are just going to be thinking about how to translate a 3D scene into a 2D composition, and then how to adjust our render settings, how to adjust lighting and materials in order to really play with color. And we'll be using just some of these polyprimitive shapes that you're welcome to manipulate to create a kind of experiment in form and color for a couple image renders that I'll be due by the end of the week. Before we get into lighting and materials, I wanted to go over a couple more tools and functions here that are within the viewport. One of them that we already know is this button here is the resolution gate, which is really important and will be important this week as well, which gives you an indication of the renderable area of your scene from your particular camera. Down here it tells us what camera we're using, and we will be creating new cameras. This perspective camera should really be reserved for navigating within your 3D scene, and then you create other perspective cameras that you then can keyframe or you can lock into place, that you can animate through your scene. That will be your renderable camera. But for now, we're going to be just working in this perspective view. But I did want to make you aware of that, and again, go over this resolution gate. This button here, anything that's highlighted in blue means that it's the function is turned on, so this just gives us an indication of that kind of scaled grid that's in the center of our scene. And then here you see that this is highlighted, which means that our objects are within a default standard shaded view, meaning that if I create an object in the center of the scene, it looks like it has a material applied to it, this Lambert one that I went over last week. And in our viewport, we see it as being the default setting, which is that it's just a shaded, it's showing us the shaded, smooth shaded view of these objects, of all the objects in our scene. We can change this, and it's these buttons here that correlate to numbers on our keyboard. So if I hit press 4, all the objects in my scene will now be in wireframe mode, which means this is useful if you're modeling and you want to see inside of an object and you want the wireframe. 5, again, is that smooth shaded. 6, which you can't tell, will display all of the objects and their textures. So it will anticipate what those textures, approximate what they'll look like in a render. And then 7 is with lighting. And as you can see, when I turn on 7, that there's no lights in the scene. There are these default lights that only correlate to being able to render out the viewport, but none of those lights actually translate into part of the renderable image. And so any objects that we put in this scene will appear black because there are no lights in the scene. So I'm going to go back to 5, but just to show you what that means, we'll go back up here and go over some of these tools again, which are our render tools. This is our render view. We also have an Arnold render view, and Arnold is a high quality renderer, meaning that it gives a really, it's a way to calculate the parameters and the attributes of particular objects, and then approximate within a realistic kind of representation of the way that light bounces off of objects, the way that shadows interplay, and things of that nature. And so if you have a powerful enough computer, you can use this Arnold render view, which can show you your render in real time. We'll get into this a little bit more, but to start, we'll just use the basic render view here. So I'm going to click this, and I already was kind of playing around here before, but let me go ahead and click this first clapboard, and you can see that nothing, when I render my scene, which again is rendering at these settings, and you can see it down here, it's rendering at 960 by 540, then nothing's appearing in the scene. And that's because we don't have any lights. And so we'll put some lights in a minute. There's some more information here in the render view that's going to be really important. To double check the size and make sure it correlates to what our render settings are is important. I'll go back over the render settings in a minute. We have what frame we're rendering, so I'm rendering frame 1. We have how much memory it took to create this render. And then for an Arnold renderer, we have the samplings. This is something we'll get into in a little greater detail in a subsequent video tutorial for this week, but these are different times that these are different parameters for the render and how many passes the renderer takes to go over a particular uh, part of the scene. So this will, I'll show you what this correlates to. This is very important, the render time, and I do want to know how long it takes for your images to render. This image that has nothing, that appears to have nothing in it, or there's no lights, took very short amount of time, 5 seconds. But it could take a good deal longer, a minute and a half, to 3 minutes. It really depends per image. So this is important to note, how long it takes to render, because then you can calculate, depending on how long your animation is, how long it's going to take to render based on whatever your sample renders that you've done throughout your scene, how long they've taken to render, and then you can estimate how long it will take to render. And then here, what camera are we rendering from? Well, we're rendering from a perspective camera. Okay, so up here there are a couple other options that we'll go over here, other tools. This brings up the render settings. We can pull these up right now, and this looks familiar. Our render settings here. This is where you would set the file output name. And when we're rendering, we're going to be rendering, what kind of image are we rendering? Well, I think we should render JPEGs. And I'm going to name my renders for today, week 2 demo. You can name it your name, last name, first name, image renders. And then here it says we're rendering a single frame. But if we're going to render out a sequence of images, we're going to want to choose this last option when we start to render out animations. So name underscore the number, which correlates to the frame number, and then dot extension, which would be dot JPEG. So we'll render out a JPEG, an image sequence of JPEGs based on the frames. But for now, we're just going to use a single frame. And then down at the bottom, our renderable camera. This we will select, and we don't have any other renderable cameras in the scene, any other perspective cameras other than the main perspective camera for now, so that's fine. And then our presets, so we'll do preset HD 540. And then as the course goes on, we will hopefully be able to increase the quality of the animations that you're producing to 720 or 1080 even. Depending on where you think your animations will go. I think if you any film festival or animation festival or any place that you're going to be potentially submitting work to as an artist, you'd want it to be rendered out at 1080. But 720 is fine for something like YouTube. 540 is a little bit, the quality is pretty, is reduced. It's almost half. It is half of a 1080 video. And then our resolution here, 72 pixels per inch is fine because this is screen-based work, so anything that's projected, that resolution works. But if these are images that you would want to print out, then you would want to increase that to about 300 pixels per inch because that correlates to the dot matrix of a printer. Okay, so that's this first common tab. At the top, it does tell us we're using Arnold Renderer. There are a couple other renderers that come standard, but the quality is pretty bad. Maya hardware almost is like just rendering. Your image quality will be almost at, not too much better than what you see in the viewport. It could be actually exactly what you're seeing in the viewport. But if you are really having trouble rendering with this higher powered renderer, well, we can just talk about what our options are then. But there are some other renderers anyway, but Arnold is the one that we want to be using because it produces really nice quality images. So there's a whole nother tab for the Arnold renderer, and these are the sampling. And this is what you're going to be adjusting. These are the settings you'll be adjusting. Then I want you to report back to me on what your settings are and then what your render time is based on those settings. So the first one, camera anti-aliasing, anytime we're going to bump this up, the image quality is going to be improved, but it's also going to just take a lot longer because you're doing a whole nother pass for every little pixel here. We're doing another pass on how to calculate based on all of the different variables in your scene, being the lighting, the materials, and how those things interplay and interact with each other within the scene. And then we have things like diffuse, spectacular, and we'll get into all of those later. Just know for now that we're going to be adjusting these settings. And then we're always going to be setting our common render settings here. What our camera is, our file name, our file format, and then for this week, just this name and a single frame. And this will be sent, and remember, every time we're going to set, right now, this my project folder is Maya demos. And then I also did those project windows, meaning that I populated my project folder with all the subsequent folders that are necessary to build a kind of proper project in Maya. And so all of our images will be saved to our images folder. So we'll see that in a little bit. In our next video, we'll get into some lighting.